The 1971 India-Pakistan War is unbelievably paradoxical. On the one hand, this war featured some of the most devastating wartime atrocities ever seen in the world. Cold-blooded genocide of Bengalis, rampant sexual violence against lakhs of women, and foreign powers that didn't just stay silent but supported the dictatorial regime in Pakistan responsible for the violence. But on the other hand, this was also the war that brought together every single Bengali in Bangladesh to band together under a single cause. Everyone, from freedom fighters to students to common villagers, gave their lives for a country that didn't even exist yet. And what's more, despite international pressure from the US and the United Nations to just sit back and watch their neighbors burn, India took a definitive stance, a moral stance, to stand and fight alongside their Bengali brothers. But in December 1971, India was standing on a knife's edge. As the Pakistan army settled into fortified bunkers at strategic points along the India-Bangladesh border, the clock was ticking down. India had less than 15 days to make it all the way from the borders straight to the heart of Dhaka. Any longer, and even more civilians would die, and the danger of the US interfering would grow day by day. For the first time in our history, all three wings of the military would be working together. The army marching through the wilderness, the Air Force destroying Pakistani installations from the skies, and the Navy deploying aircraft carriers and warships to sink Pakistani ships. With the help of fearless Bengali guerrilla fighters, the race to Dhaka was on. A lightning campaign to carve out a brand new nation in blood and bullets. Bangladesh. It all began when the results of the 1970 general elections in Pakistan were announced. The Awami League from East Pakistan had won the vote by a landslide, winning more seats in the National Assembly than all the parties in West Pakistan combined. The news sent shockwaves through Islamabad, which for the last 2 decades had been the center of power for both East and West Pakistan. And now, the president of Pakistan would be a Bengali man? This one election would set off a runaway chain reaction of events that would spark a new independence movement, the largest military conflict since World War II, and would draw the attention of every major world power, from the US to China and even Russia. But hold on, why did the West Pakistanis hate the idea of a Bengali president so much? It goes back to when the British granted the Indian subcontinent independence in 1947. During the partition, the Muslim-majority regions neighboring India formed their own country, Pakistan. Today, it sounds absurd to have your country split into 2 halves, each of which spoke different languages, had totally different cultures, and was separated by nearly 1,000 miles. Back then, it was believed that the common Islamic faith would hold the nation together. But while the eastern and western halves were equal in population, they certainly weren't equal in politics. The Punjabis and Pathans of West Pakistan considered themselves racially superior to the Bengalis and hated their eastern cousins. They believed they were the true representatives of the Muslim faith and that the Bengalis were too culturally influenced by India. Urdu was imposed in school curricula even in East Pakistan, where 99% of the population spoke Bengali. Long before the events of 1971, deep currents of resentment rippled among the Bengalis, who protested time and time again for more autonomy in East Pakistan. The man leading these protests was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, leader of the Awami League, the guy who won the general elections in 1970 and was due to be Pakistan's next president. For the first time in decades, the Bengalis would be represented by a leader they chose, and the hope was that with Sheikh Mujib as president, East Pakistan would finally get an equal seat at the political table. As you can imagine, this did not go down well in West Pakistan. Not only did they hate the Bengalis, but they knew that East Pakistan had much more active trade and manufacturing infrastructure. If Islamabad gave up control of the nation to a Bengali president, what would stop him from slowly shifting the balance of power towards the east until they started taking orders from Dhaka? The West Pakistanis saw this as an existential threat. So, after years of activism, protests, and political campaigning for his people, Sheikh Mujib's victory was snatched right out of his hands when Yahya Khan, the president of Pakistan, refused to honor the election results, and several leaders in Islamabad boycotted the National Assembly. When they heard the news, the Bengali people erupted in protests across East Pakistan. demanding that their democratically elected leader be given the seat he'd rightfully won. Sheikh Mujib rallied the citizens behind a civil disobedience movement and was even publicly speaking about the complete secession of East Pakistan into its own nation. The pressure was mounting on Islamabad, who were holding frantic talks about how to handle the escalating crisis with the Bengalis. But behind closed doors, the leaders of West Pakistan were formulating a plan that not even Sheikh Mujib could have known about, a secret conspiracy to undermine the power and autonomy of East Pakistan by any means necessary. In a mysterious coincidence, several high-level Bengali army officers were quietly being transferred from key military outposts to some nondescript rural areas. East Pakistani army regiments were inexplicably being asked to surrender their weapons, and under absolute secrecy, thousands of West Pakistani troops were being transferred to Dhaka, along with shipments of ammunition, supplies, and tanks. If anyone asked, they were just going to blame it on ongoing tensions with India. By March of 1971, the whole of East Pakistan was rioting against the government's decision, essentially bringing the entire province to a standstill. Sheikh Mujib was addressing crowds of over 1 million people in Dhaka, calling for an independent nation for the Bengalis. Backed into a corner, President Yahya Khan announced that the National Assembly would finally reconvene on 25th March. But little did the people of Bangladesh know that this was nothing more than a ruse. The president had no intentions of actually listening to their demands. On the contrary, that day, 25th March, would mark the beginning of the most brutal extermination campaign against the Bengali people in history. Fair warning, the things I'm about to narrate in this next part pertain to the deeply disturbing acts committed by the Pakistan army against innocent Bangladeshi citizens. And trust me when I say this, I'm having to censor myself pretty hard so I don't get demonetized, but the full extent of these war crimes is far beyond what you can imagine. As teachers, professors, and students entered the Dhaka University on 25th March 1971, they couldn't have known that just outside the city, multiple regiments of the Pakistan army were piling into their trucks, armed with automatic rifles, machine guns, and rocket launchers. The convoy was led by a battalion of tanks, rolling out onto the streets of Dhaka, headed for the university. A few days prior, Yahya Khan had brought in the infamous army chief, Tikka Khan, a man otherwise known as the Butcher of Balochistan, to lead the invasion of Bangladesh. The president had given his army chief just one order: sort them out. As the tanks stormed past the university gates, the army fanned out across the campus, rounding up professors, students, and staff. And then the killings began. It didn't matter if they were Muslim, Hindu, or Christian. It didn't matter if they were active supporters of the Awami League or just there to study. The Pakistani soldiers had a simple objective: leave no one alive. They surrounded student dormitories, cutting off any escape, and began firing straight through the doors and windows. Besides the dozens of staff and professors at the university, more than 300 students were killed that day alone. None of them could have been more than 24 years old. But why attack a university? We've seen this pattern of targeting intellectuals time and time again in recent history. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Nazi massacre of Polish elites, the persecution of intellectuals in China, the Soviet Union, the list just goes on. You see, an authoritarian regime thrives on the suppression of knowledge and total control over the population. But educated people are capable of spreading anti-authoritarian ideologies through activism, books, poetry, and political campaigning. If you can cut off the flow of ideas, you can demoralize the resistance, spread your own propaganda, and keep the population divided and in control. For Pakistan, the goal was to strike at the heart of Bangladesh, arrest or kill the leaders of the Awami League, and silence the rebellions against the government once and for all. But the invasion of Bangladesh, dubbed Operation Searchlight by the Pakistan army, didn't just target Dhaka. By the end of March 1971, they'd overrun the entire province. Troops were being deployed from all across the borders deep into the territory, burning villages and towns in their path and callously massacring civilians. Initially, the Pakistan army faced an unexpected wave of resistance from the Bengali freedom fighters who roamed the dense forests of Bangladesh, fighting back against the invaders. But there's only so much that disorganized volunteers lacking training or equipment can do in the face of a professional army. Eventually, the Pakistan army had occupied most of the region, setting up outposts near major towns and cities. And then, the real campaign of terror was unleashed on Bangladesh. Pakistani soldiers would enter villages in the countryside, round up civilians, torture them to extract information, and execute them in full public view. But a much worse fate awaited the women. They'd be dragged back to the army camps where they would be raped mercilessly by multiple soldiers before they were killed and replaced by new victims. It's estimated that by the end of the war, anywhere between 2 to 4 lakh women suffered this gruesome fate, and between 10 to 30 lakh Bangladeshi civilians were slaughtered by the Pakistan army. It was the single greatest humanitarian atrocity seen in the Indian subcontinent in the last century. Desperate Bangladeshis poured out of the countryside and into India, seeking asylum in West Bengal and Tripura. In the matter of a few months, more than 1 crore refugees wallowed in crowded refugee camps, and India was feeling the heat. The sudden influx of people put an enormous strain on food supply to the border regions, and lakhs of Hindu refugees were suddenly in close contact with the largely Muslim population around the borders of West Bengal, increasing communal tensions. For India, the issue had suddenly gone from a squabble between neighbors to a full-blown political crisis. I want to take a second here to point out that while Bangladesh was being ravaged, none of the major Western powers, not the UK, not France, not Canada, no one spoke out against the violence or tried to take any action. In fact, as we'll see very soon, the United States openly supported Pakistan's atrocities and would send millions of dollars worth of military aid to them. But something had changed among the people of Bangladesh. Amidst the chaos and tragedy, they developed a renewed sense of purpose, a unified sense of belonging to this nation that didn't even exist yet. Survivors of Pakistan's violence formed a resistance force called the Mukti Bahini, a group with the sole objective of winning the country's independence. There was no longer a world in which the Bengalis would go back to being East Pakistan ever again. Even as the Bangladeshis were forming their own identity, the Indian government was scrambling to figure out what to do about all this. If you were alive in the 1970s, you know that India back then wasn't exactly an economic powerhouse. They couldn't afford to shelter the refugees forever, nor could they continue to watch the genocide of Bengalis from the sidelines and not intervene. But when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi spoke to Army General Sam Manekshaw about taking the necessary steps, he firmly put his foot down. Not because he didn't want to, but because the Indian military was simply not ready. After coming dangerously close to losing the 1965 war with Pakistan, India had realized that its military was seriously lacking on several fronts. Lack of manpower, outdated equipment, and research and development capabilities. It was still in the process of modernizing and expanding its military apparatus when the Bangladesh Liberation War broke out unexpectedly. The problem was, if they tried to invade Bangladesh in the middle of the year, Pakistan would obviously retaliate from the west, leaving India exposed on that front. To make matters worse, at this time of year, the snow would have melted from the Himalayan passes, allowing Chinese troops to come to Pakistan's aid from the north. And worst of all, Bangladesh was a rainy, marshy country with 3 gigantic rivers and several smaller ones that would be impossible to traverse in the height of monsoon. The only thing Sam Manekshaw asked for is time. Just a few months to mobilize troops to both the western and eastern borders, allowing the Himalayan passes to get snowed in and wait for the weather to become more suitable for an army to pass through. Indira Gandhi had learned to trust the judgment of a man whose career had begun in the front lines of World War II. She agreed to his recommendations. The Indian army wasn't just sitting idle in the interim. They began training volunteers in the refugee camps to use guns, organize themselves into effective units, and follow strategic maneuvers against the enemy. By now, several regiments of the East Pakistan Army had defected and joined the Mukti Bahini and used their military training to further bolster the ranks of the resistance fighters. The Bangladeshi freedom fighters took on their new mission with enthusiasm, launching guerrilla attacks on Pakistani convoys, cutting off their lines of communication, sabotaging roads, railways and bridges, and generally making life as hard as possible for the enemy. Within Bangladesh, even the Gram Parishads of villages got involved, helping the Mukti Bahini by giving them shelter and supplies. The Mukti Bahini was truly a fascinating movement. Comprised mostly of students and youths, they were one of the most educated armed forces in history. Every 6 weeks, some 2,000 guerrilla fighters were being trained and deployed. They were being supplied with arms and ammunition by India and took advantage of any available space to form a temporary base of operation, like abandoned school buildings and warehouses. They were regularly clashing with Pakistani soldiers, managing to kill hundreds of them while incurring very few casualties. History has few instances of an entire nation rallying behind a singular cause so effectively as the Mukti Bahini. Meanwhile, the western frontiers of India were heating up with activity as India prepared to receive the first strike from Pakistan. This is what they were actually hoping for. If Pakistan could be seen as the aggressor, India would be completely justified in retaliating as per international laws. That's exactly what happened on 3rd December 1971. Pakistan launched a number of airstrikes against Indian airfields, dropping hundreds of bombs. For some reason, the Pakistanis assumed that the Indian Air Force would just have its aircraft parked out in the open on the airfield. So when the bombs fell, only the runways were damaged, while the aircraft were sitting unharmed in hangars. The Air Force were able to quickly repair the runways, then launched a massive counter-offensive, hitting 8 Pakistani airfields and radar installations. Within a couple of days, the Pakistan Air Force had lost 25 aircraft and was more or less out of commission in the west. Pakistan even attempted to launch attacks by land, sending thousands of infantry troops and tanks towards Rajasthan and Kashmir. But India was ready for them. Here again, the Air Force struck like deadly raptors, blasting enemy convoys with pinpoint precision and costing Pakistan over 50 tanks and 3,000 troops. The Rajasthani desert had become a smoking, charred graveyard for Pakistani tanks. The Western theatre of war was tipping overwhelmingly in favor of India, which meant both good news and bad news. The good news was that the Indian army would finally be able to begin their mission to liberate Bangladesh. The bad news was that India was now firmly in the crosshairs of international powers like the UN, Europe, and most dangerously, the United States. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate if you drop a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support me in making more high quality documentaries like this, you can become a member of my channel to get early access to videos, vote for my upcoming video topics, and more. Just click join under this video or on my channel to get started. Now back to the video. Look at this satellite view of the terrain in Bangladesh. By far the most dominant feature of the landscape are the 3 major rivers cutting across the map: the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna, all of which culminate in the enormous Sundarbans Delta. Hundreds of smaller tributaries and streams crisscross the landscape, while the major rivers can be anywhere from 2 to 10 kilometers wide. The locals mostly relied on boats to ferry them across the rivers, which meant that there were few bridges available in the region. What's more, the center of power, Dhaka, was situated in the very heart of the province, far away from the borders or the sea. All that is to say, the terrain of Bangladesh was a dream for any defending army and nothing short of a nightmare for the invaders. This fact was no doubt playing on the mind of Lieutenant General Jagjit Singh Arora, commander of the eastern forces around the Bangladesh border, as he planned the assault. The goal of his mission was simple: enter Bangladesh, capture Dhaka, and force Pakistan to surrender. The offensive would take place on 4 fronts: the southeast from Tripura, the north from Assam, and the northwest and west from West Bengal. But there was one major problem. While the rest of the world condemned the actions of Pakistan, the United States remained firmly allied to them and opposed any military action by India. They were putting pressure on Indira Gandhi to call for a ceasefire, and if that didn't happen, they had Navy warships and aircraft carriers ready to intervene. What this meant was that India had limited time to complete their mission. Just 12 days to invade Bangladesh, cross several rivers and hundreds of kilometers, defeat the Pakistani defense, and force them to surrender. Already, the Pakistan army was hunkering down at key defensive positions, constructing concrete bunkers, and stocking up on ammunition supplied by the US. It was later found that Pakistan had diverted relief funds for Bangladesh refugees to cover the cost of building these fortified bunkers. As much as 29 lakh rupees per bunker, or more than 1.7 crore rupees in today's money. On 4th December 1971, the first Indian soldiers crossed the border into Bangladesh, joined by thousands of Mukti Bahini freedom fighters. All told, J.S. Aurora was commanding a combined force of nearly 5 lakh combatants, the single largest military deployment in history. Despite this, there was no guarantee of victory. The Indian Army had to play it smart, avoiding major roads and bridges, using rickshaws and bicycles to transport equipment over uneven terrain. Crucially, they were not going to stop and fight at every single location where Pakistani soldiers were stationed, which would just slow them down. They were all racing to reach Dhaka before time ran out. One of the first major victories of the assault was by the Indian Air Force, who unleashed a blitzkrieg on Pakistani air bases in Bangladesh, demolishing their runways with bombs and missiles. Within 2 days of the invasion, India had achieved total air superiority in the eastern skies, which meant that the army had no restrictions on movement and didn't have to worry about camouflaging themselves against airstrikes. Now, the Air Force could focus on providing 24/7 air support for the ground-based troops, allowing them to advance at a rapid pace on all fronts. But it wasn't all good news for India. As the Indian Navy prepared to enter the Bay of Bengal to create a blockade against Pakistani ships, word came down that under the orders of the US President Richard Nixon, a task force of US Navy warships and a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was being prepared to engage with the Indian Navy fleet. This meant that the Indian Army was quickly running out of time to reach Dhaka, and the Navy's only aircraft carrier, the INS Vikrant, was in serious danger. But there was one solution. If the Indian Navy was able to destroy Pakistan's airfields and ships in Bangladesh, Pakistani troops would not be able to evacuate, and the US Navy would have no reason to attack. After all, the US wasn't trying to join the war, they just wanted to force India to retreat from Bangladesh. The Indian Navy knew that Pakistan had a submarine, the PNS Ghazi, which was capable of sinking the INS Vikrant. If they wanted to get close to Bangladesh, the submarine had to be eliminated. So, the Navy pulled off a brilliant bit of tactical deception. They quietly parked the INS Vikrant in the Andaman Islands while they placed a decoy ship in the Vishakhapatnam port, making the Pakistan Navy think they were coming from that direction. They even accidentally broadcast unclassified telegrams where a naval officer in Vishakhapatnam was asking about the health of his sick mother. Believing that they had access to crucial intelligence about the INS Vikrant, the PNS Ghazi made its way down to the Vishakhapatnam port, where it was promptly sunk by the Indian Navy. With their biggest threat eliminated, the INS Vikrant was able to lead its fleet to the coast of Bangladesh, where it deployed squadrons of fighter jets and bombers to completely incapacitate Pakistani airfields in Chittagong and Cox's Bazar. They even destroyed camouflage ships that were going to evacuate Pakistani soldiers, trapping them in Bangladesh. By this point, the US Navy's fleet was still off the coast of Sri Lanka, thousands of kilometers from the combat zone. Seeing that there was no point in engaging the Indian Navy now, they decided to just head back. While all this was happening, the Indian Army was coming up against their most difficult challenge yet: crossing the rivers of Bangladesh. One of Pakistan's major garrisons was stationed in the city of Sylhet, and the Indian Army had to cross the Surma River to engage with the enemy. The only bridge across the river was unviable. They'd be sitting ducks for the Pakistani defenders. Keenly aware that time was running out, Lieutenant General Sagat Singh did something no one anticipated. He ordered a squadron of Mi-4 helicopters to act as air bridges, carrying troops across the river and allowing them to surround Sylhet on the same day. Hearing the constant drone of helicopters all day, the Pakistani garrison believed an enormous assault force was on its way, and within less than a day, Sagat Singh was able to move his entire division across the Surma, along with several mounted guns and ammunition. Over the coming days, the defending Pakistan army was becoming increasingly aware of the one-sidedness of this war. Not only had they completely lost air and naval support against the constant bombardments by the Indian Air Force, but they were operationally paralyzed on the ground. The freedom fighters of the Mukti Bahini were tormenting them with guerrilla attacks, while local Bengali villagers were offering support to the Indian army every step of the way. Hundreds of men and women would help them carry heavy equipment on cycles and rickshaws, offer food and shelter to the soldiers, and even put their own lives at risk to spy on the positions of Pakistani defenders and report to the Indian Army commanders. The enemy's horrific treatment of Bangladeshi civilians in the last few months was coming back to haunt them. Less than a week into the invasion, one thing became very clear. It was a matter of when, not if, the Pakistani army would surrender. Only question was, how much longer would they hold out? Because there were still lakhs of civilians trapped in Dhaka whose lives were in immediate danger. The Indian army was not taking any chances. On the afternoon of 11 December, the Army and Air Force launched the single largest airborne operation since World War II. 750 paratroopers were dropped near the town of Tangail, a key strategic location controlled by the Mukti Bahini. To confuse the enemy, they even dropped dummy paratroopers in a different location, allowing them to secure a bridge and block the Pakistanis from retreating back to Dhaka. This operation, along with another massive helicopter river crossing over the Meghna River, ensured that Dhaka was completely surrounded, sealing the fate of the enemy defenders within its walls. The Indian army had encircled the capital city, trapping them inside. With an aim to end the bloodshed, General Sam Manekshaw asked the Pakistan Army General Amir Khan Niazi to surrender. In a last-ditch effort, he tried to negotiate for a ceasefire, but it was overwhelmingly clear that Pakistan had no leverage left in the war. And so, on 16 December 1971, after a 12-day lightning campaign to Dhaka, the Pakistan army surrendered, giving up control of the province of East Pakistan, which officially became recognized as the sovereign nation of Bangladesh. Over the coming weeks, India oversaw the safe return of more than 10 million refugees back to their homeland. Despite the war coming to an end, Pakistan's President Yahya Khan wanted to execute Sheikh Mujibur Rahman as a final act of spite. The greatest irony is that the man who finally convinced him to let go of this pointless hostility was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who had been the first leader to boycott the National Assembly. Even after the war, skirmishes continued between India and Pakistan on the Western Front, while Bangladesh welcomed its first president, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who saw to it that his new nation would be formally recognized in the international community. But in history, there's no such thing as a happy ending. Just 3 years after his country was liberated, Sheikh Mujib and most of his family were assassinated in a violent military coup, which set the stage for a decade of turmoil in the country as power-hungry leaders fought and killed each other for the top position. The India-Pakistan front has since always remained deeply contentious, and as of the time of publishing this video, the two nations are abiding by a tense ceasefire after India's retaliation against the terrorist attack in Pahalgam. At this point, India simply wishes for peace, and we never have and never will provoke an escalation of the conflict. But I think it's been made increasingly clear both in history and in the ongoing events that when that peace is disturbed, the Indian armed forces will not sit quietly by and watch innocent lives be lost. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment. You can also support my channel by becoming a member, where you'll get early access to videos, vote on my upcoming video topics, and ask me questions each month. I'm Anish Bhargav, and I'll see you in the next one.